One child. That was the price. In the year AD 376, on the northern edge of the Roman Empire, a single loaf of bread bought a Gothic father the right to sell his own son into slavery. The buyers wore no furs and carried no barbarian names. They were Roman officers, agents of the state, men with rank and seal. Rome had shipped grain north to feed the thousands crowding the Danube, fleeing the Huns at their backs. The commanders of the frontier read that grain as inventory. They locked it in warehouses. They let hunger sharpen. Then they named their price, and the price was measured in human beings. This was not war. It was a market. Its currency was flesh, and its ledger was kept in a Roman hand. That bureaucratic cruelty did not close with a column of profits. It closed with a Roman field army wiped out, a Roman emperor gone without a grave, and a wound the empire would carry until it stopped bleeding only because it stopped living. The machine of Roman administration did not simply break down, it turned inward and consumed itself. The man the record blames is the Emperor Flavius Julius Valens. On the 9th of August, AD 378, outside the walls of Adrianople, Valens led his legions into a defeat so total that Roman writers reached back 6 centuries for a comparison and landed on Hannibal at Cannae. 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army, the trained core of imperial power, was gone before the sun set. Valens vanished into that ruin. His body was never recovered. For 1,600 years, the verdict has held without challenge. He stands accused of pride, of an impatience close to madness, of an incompetence deep enough to snap the spine of Rome in the east. The charge is tidy. A vain emperor, hungry for a triumph he could call his own, wagered an army and lost it whole. But that charge rests on the word of one man. The prosecution's chief witness is a retired soldier named Ammianus Marcellinus, the last great historian Rome produced. His account of Valens and the Gothic War is a work of real power, and it is the only detailed eyewitness version that survived the centuries. His testimony convicted the emperor in the court of history, and no defense was ever called. Consider this the defense being called. We will put the witness on the stand. We will weigh his evidence, test where his story bends, and listen for the sound of his own grievances underneath it. Because somewhere between the greed of the frontier commanders and the ambition of the throne sits a harder truth about why the legions died. The question was never only what happened on that plain. The question is who wrote the ending of the Roman world and why he wanted it read this way. Tell us which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. If you value this kind of historical investigation, take a moment to subscribe and support the project. You're watching an Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The charge sheet against Valens opens 2 years before he died, and it opens in mud. The place is the northern bank of the Danube, near the fortress of Durostorum. The year is AD 376. The accusation is not treason. It is not cowardice under attack. It is negligence of a kind that is hard to hold in the mind at full size, because the number of people it touched runs into the tens of thousands. Ammianus, straining for a figure, reaches for the old line about counting the sands of the Libyan desert. He means the crowd was past counting. They came to the river not as an army, but as a people torn off their land. The Tervingi Goths, driven west by the Huns pressing in from the steppe. Whole families stood on that bank. Old men who remembered other rivers. Wives. Wagons stacked with everything a household owns when it runs at short notice. The Danube in late summer runs wide and brown there, swollen by rain in the highlands, and it was running hard. Ammianus writes that men who tried to cross on rafts and hollowed logs and their own 2 arms were pulled under by the current, and that the far bank filled with the drowned. Behind the survivors, a terror they could not fight. In front of them, a border and the promise of Rome. Their leader was Fritigern, and Fritigern did not come asking for battle. He sent envoys south to the Emperor Valens with a formal petition for asylum. The terms were generous to Rome. The Goths would surrender their weapons. They would give their young men to the legions as auxiliary soldiers. They would settle quietly on Roman ground in Thrace and work it. In return, they asked 2 things only: protection and grain. There was nothing strange in the request. This was routine. The Roman machine had been swallowing barbarian peoples for 4 centuries. It was a system built to take a threat outside the wall and turn it into muscle and taxes inside the wall. Settle them, feed them, draft their sons, watch them become Roman within 2 generations. The historian Eutropius, writing in these same years, could still describe frontier settlement as an ordinary tool of state, the kind an emperor signed off on between other business. Valens signed off on it too. He was campaigning in the east and short of recruits, and a nation offering its young men looked, from Antioch, like a bargain. Themistius, the orator at his court, later spun the whole affair as farmland gained and soldiers won. On paper, AD 320 marks was one more entry in a ledger the administration knew by heart. But the machine had corroded from the inside, and the rot had a name. 2 names. Valens had placed the Thracian frontier in the hands of Count Lupicinus and an officer called Maximus. Our witness, Ammianus Marcellinus, knew the type from 30 years in uniform under Julian and Constantius, and he does not soften them. He does not draw commanders. He draws hunters. When the imperial order came down, receive the Goths, feed the Goths, keep them alive, Lupicinus did not see a supply problem. He saw a column of profit waiting to be entered in his own accounts. The grain shipped from the interior to feed the refugees was diverted before it reached a single mouth. It was carried into the military storehouses and locked there. The hunger this created was not an accident of logistics. It was manufactured on purpose to raise a price. And as the Goths, who had already crossed, weakened, Lupicinus and Maximus opened a market of their own. The rates tell the whole story. Ammianus set them down in detail, and the detail is the horror. Dogs were sold as food, 1 animal traded for 1 human being to be led away into slavery. Rotten meat went for silver. Every household object of value passed across the counter and then was gone. When the coin and the ornaments ran out, the commanders named a final currency. They took children. For 1 loaf of bread, a Gothic family could hand over a son or a daughter into bondage on Roman soil. Read that as what it was. Men sworn to enforce Roman law had turned the frontier into a trafficking floor and set the exchange rate themselves. Now, the prosecution reaches for Exhibit A, the object at the dead center of everything that followed, the sword. Imperial policy on this point was flat. Any group settled inside the frontier had to be disarmed. Every blade surrendered at the crossing. It was the price of admission, the one rule the system could not bend without unmaking itself. And Lupicinus discovered that this rule, too, had a market value. He took bribes. For a fee in silver, a Gothic warrior kept his weapons. For a larger fee, he could buy a fresh blade, Roman forged, off the very men meant to strip him bare. Thousands of swords that should have gone into the furnaces of the state armories. the fabricae at cities like Sirmium that stamped out weapons by the crate, crossed instead into Roman territory in Gothic hands, bought and paid for. Ammianus reaches for a single word to describe the greed of the commanders, insatiable. And he records the outcome flatly. Not one Gothic chief was made to give up his arms. There was a second people at the river, too. Behind the Tervingi came the Grievances under Alathius and Saphrax, and them Valens had refused. They were to be kept on the far bank. But with the frontier guards distracted by the profits of the crossing, the Grievances built rafts and came over anyway, uncounted and unwatched. Rome had lost track of its own border while its officers weighed silver. Hold the picture the corruption assembled, piece by piece, a starving people, their families broken and sold at the warehouse door, and in their fists steel. They were hungry, humiliated, extorted at every crossing, and armed. Lupicinus and Maximus had not merely mishandled a refugee crisis. They had built, with patience, an engine of rebellion inside their own province, wired it, and set the fuse. It needed one spark. The spark was struck at dinner. The city was Marcianople, capital of the province of Moesia Secunda, a walled town of colonnaded streets, named for a sister of the Emperor Trajan. Lupicinus kept his residence there, sensing, perhaps, that the thing he had built was slipping past his control. He chose a fix that married treachery to plain stupidity. He invited the two foremost Gothic leaders, Fritigern and Alavivus, to a banquet inside his walls. Their bodyguards and warriors were to be held outside in the streets, kept from the market and from their lords. Roman guards manned the gates and would not let the Goths in to buy food. The design was old and Roman: kill the leaders at the table, then fall on the leaderless men outside while they were still confused. Cut off the head and the body goes to ground. But a decapitation strike lives or dies on discipline and surprise, and Lupicinus commanded neither. Picture the hall as Ammianus lets us glimpse it. Lamps and warmth inside, wine poured, dishes brought in on the show of Roman hospitality. The whole theater of a border governor entertaining chieftains he means to murder before the plates are cleared. Outside in the cold streets, men who had crossed a river of the drowned to be told there was no bread for them. Lupicinus's soldiers, arrogant and drunk, began jeering at the Goths penned along the walls. Words became shoving, shoving became blades. The Romans set on the Gothic retainers, and the noise of that killing traveled up through the stone into the banquet hall. At the table, Fritigern and Alavivus understood at once. Roman officers around them, doors barred behind them, and through the wall, the sound of their own men dying in the open air. A smaller man draws a hidden knife and dies well and pointlessly. Fritigern did something else. Even Ammianus, who owed the Goths nothing and liked them less, gives him a reluctant nod. Fritigern kept his face still. He rose and told his hosts that only he could go out and settle his people, that without him the misunderstanding would swell into a slaughter that served no one. He offered himself as the sole man who could restore calm. It was manipulation of the first order, delivered inside a trap already closing, and Lupicinus, whose greed was matched only by his slowness, believed it. He opened the door and let Fritigern walk free. Alavivus, the record suggests, did not walk out. His name drops out of the story here in that hall and never returns. From this night forward, there is one Gothic leader, and it is Fritigern. That single decision cost Rome the war before the war had properly begun. Fritigern stepped out of the residence, looked at the bodies of his men in the street, and read the truth in one glance. There would be no peace. He swung up onto his horse, gathered the survivors, and rode out of Marcianople no longer a supplicant, but a commander in open revolt. What followed came fast. The armed and famished Gothic multitude, welded together now by Roman betrayal and led by a mind Rome had badly underrated, tore across Thrace. They stopped asking for grain and began seizing it. They stormed the villas and the country estates. They emptied the storehouses whose grain had been hoarded against them. They broke open the mines and the slave barracks and freed their own kin. Ammianus notes something bitter here, that Goths sold into servitude only weeks before now turned and guided the raiders to the richest houses and the deepest granaries, because they had lived in them and knew where everything was kept. The extortion had produced its own guides. Lupicinus, chasing the flames he had lit, scraped together the local troops within reach and marched out about 9 miles from the city to face Fritigern. The encounter that followed does not deserve the word battle. The Roman force was mostly garrison men of low grade, and they broke. 2 legions lost their standards, the eagles that carried the honor and the memory of the unit, the objects a legion would die to protect, and did not. Tribunes and senior officers ran and left their soldiers in the field. Lupicinus fled back to Marcianople with his life and nothing else. Ammianus writes that the Goths stripped the Roman dead of their arms and armor and put them on, and from that day the rebels no longer fought as tribesmen. They fought equipped as Romans, in Roman mail, behind Roman shields. The prosecution wants this fixed clearly, because the popular story misplaces it. Thrace was not lost at Adrianople in AD 378. Thrace was lost 18 months earlier in a panicked rout produced by the corruption and cowardice of Rome's own frontier command. The Goths did not defeat the Roman army in that first clash. The Roman army handed itself over. First blood, first captured gear, and the momentum of a cause that now had every right to feel righteous. The rising spread on its own gravity. Ammianus records that a band of Goths already serving in the Roman army near Adrianople, mistreated and mocked by the town, killed their officers and joined Fritigern. So did miners fleeing the imperial gold works, men who knew the hidden valleys and the sunken paths of the Thracian hills and led the raiders through them. There is a darker turn still in his account. Some among the raiders had been sold south of the mountains months earlier, and now came back over the passes with the columns, pointing out the estates that had bought them. Every act of Roman contempt over the past year came back into the field wearing armor. This was the crisis that finally reached the emperor. Valens was in Antioch, deep in preparations for a great campaign against Persia, Rome's oldest and most dangerous rival. The dispatches from Thrace arrived as an irritation, a provincial mess that would not stay provincial. He negotiated a hasty truce on the eastern frontier, shelved his Persian war, pulled his best legions off that line, and turned west. He reached Constantinople in the spring of AD 378. The capital did not greet him as a savior. Constantinople in those months was a city on edge. It had lost its peace in the doctrinal wars over Arianism that Valens himself had inflamed. The emperor held to the Arian creed in a city increasingly against it, and the pulpits were against him with it. The citizens had been safe behind the great land walls while the countryside burned, and they mocked him for it. They called him a coward who let barbarians roam free. Insults appeared scrawled in the streets. In the hippodrome the crowds chanted at him. Ammianus draws Valens as thin-skinned and easily wounded, and to a ruler built that way, this jeering was unbearable. The need for a fast, unmistakable victory pressed down on him like a stone. Then came the message from his nephew. Gratian ruled the West, 19 years old, admired, and freshly triumphant. He had just crushed the Alemanni at Argentovaria on the Rhine, a victory the panegyrists were already turning into song. He was marching east with a veteran army to reinforce his uncle. His counsel was short and militarily flawless. Wait, let the Western army arrive. Combined, the two forces would be overwhelming. The Goths would be caught between them and destroyed. For Valens, the prosecution insists, it was impossible. Ammianus lays the emperor's mind bare, and the portrait is unkind. Valens was eaten by envy of a nephew barely more than a boy. The thought of Gratian sweeping in to rescue the situation and carry off the glory was more than his pride could hold. He wanted this victory as his own possession. He needed it to silence the streets of Constantinople, to reassert his authority, to climb out from under the shadow of a younger man everyone preferred. And that hunger drove him to the last mistake. The scouts came back with a count. They put the Gothic force near Adrianople at roughly 10,000 fighting men. For an emperor hunting a reason to strike, the figure was a gift handed across the table. 10,000 his army could manage alone, without Gratian, without sharing anything. It was the perfect number. It was also badly wrong. The scouts had seen only Fritigern's infantry drawn up behind their ring of wagons, the lager. They had missed the true weight of the Gothic army, a heavy cavalry force of Greuthungi and Alan horsemen under Alathius and Saphrax, off foraging, away from the camp, invisible on the day the count was taken. Valens's seasoned generals pressed for restraint. Victor, a Sarmatian by birth and a veteran of the Persian wars, argued to wait for the West. Richomers, an officer Gratian had sent ahead, carried the same message and offered himself as a hostage of good faith to buy the delay. But the officials around the throne, chief among them the general Sebastianus, told the emperor the thing he ached to hear. Sebastianus had just cut up a Gothic foraging party in a night ambush and returned flush with confidence. "Attack now," he urged. "An easy victory, and yours alone." Ammianus fixes the moment with a phrase, a lamentable display of arrogance, and Valens chose. He would not wait. He believed the broken count because it flattered his ambition. That is the final charge. Willful recklessness, with sound advice ringing in his ears. It is precisely here where the fate of an empire narrows to the temper of one insecure man on a hot morning, that the work we do on this channel earns its keep. A textbook hands you a lost battle and a date. We are here to trace the chain of human failure that built the battlefield long before the first sword cleared its sheath. The greed at the warehouse, the pride on the throne, the envy of a boy's crown. If that kind of investigation matters to you, join our inner circle, the lineage, the channel's membership club. Members are patrons of this project. You keep the archives open and the research honest, and in return, you get early access to every new documentary before it goes public. If you feel the pull to understand the real machinery of the past, press join and become part of the lineage. The prosecution rests, and it rests on this image. It is the morning of the 9th of August, AD 378. The Roman army, the trained heart of the Eastern Empire, has been marched roughly 8 miles through the open Thracian heat over broken ground. No water was carried for the distance. Ammianus adds a detail that damns the day before a blow is struck. The Goths had set fire to the dry fields and the stubble across the plain. So the Romans advanced through smoke and rising heat, breathing ash. The sun hammered down on iron helmets, and mail heated like a cooking pot. From inside their wagon fort, the Goths sent out envoys, one after another, spinning out talk they never meant to finish, stalling deliberately. Fritigern proposed an exchange of hostages. He asked that a man of rank ride into his camp to guarantee terms. Ricomers volunteered to go. He drew the negotiation out over hours. He was buying time. He was waiting for the horsemen of Elatheus and Saphrax to come thundering back over the horizon, and the Roman soldiers stood. For hours they stood in full array under a white sky, through smoke and thirst, cooking inside their armor, held in place by an emperor who was told to wait, urged to be careful, and chose his own glory over their lives instead. On the ledger of history, the verdict looks already written. The man is guilty. But out beyond the burning grass, a low sound was building along the edge of the world, and it was the sound of hooves. The prosecution's case is clean. It runs in a straight line from imperial vanity to a field of Roman dead, and every step of that line is drawn by one hand. That is where the defense begins. Not by denying Adrianople, the catastrophe is not in dispute. The defense begins by turning the light off the accused and onto the man who wrote the accusation. Who was Ammianus Marcellinus? And the harder question underneath it, what did he need us to believe? He was no senator dictating from a shaded villa in Campania. He was a soldier, a Greek speaker born in Antioch, of good family, who served years in the field as a protector domesticus, one of the elite staff officers attached to the high command. He rode on the Persian campaigns of the Emperor Julian and lived through the retreat of AD 363 that killed his emperor near the Tigris. He had been inside the walls of Amida in 359 when the Persians took it, and he escaped the sack by slipping out a postern gate in the dark. He tells us so himself, one man among a handful who got clear as the city burned behind them, and the Persian king counted his own dead in the thousands. He knew the taste of dust in a marching column and the particular silence of a garrison waiting for the ladders to go up. He respected the hard men of the frontier and loathed the perfumed order of the palace. And he wrote his great history decades later in Rome, an old pagan setting down the last major work of Latin history, carrying it down to the very year of Adrianople, and stopping there under the reign of Theodosius, the man raised to the purple precisely because Valens had failed so absolutely. That is not a neutral pen. That is a man with a fixed idea of how the world had gone wrong, writing the chapter that proved it. Hold his text up and turn it in the light, and the grain runs one direction. He writes with open scorn for the eunuchs and chamberlains of the court, the palace men he blamed for hollowing out Roman manhood. He mocks the crowds of Constantinople for caring more about the color of a charioteer's tunic than the fate of a province. He devotes whole digressions to the decadence of the Roman aristocracy, their perfumed baths, their libraries shut like tombs, their vast retinues parading through the streets with fans and cooks and eunuchs in tow, their dinners weighed on scales for show. He is a soldier's soldier, and his history is not only a record, it is a sermon. It is a lament for a lost discipline and an indictment of the soft, grasping, paper-shuffling state he believed had eaten the old virtue alive. So when Ammianus tells us Valens was swayed by flatterers and gnawed by envy, we have to ask what we are reading, a psychological diagnosis of a real man, or an emperor cut to fit a story already written in the historian's chest? Consider how he frames him. Valens the provincial from Pannonia, plain, badly schooled, so poor a speaker that he shrank from public oratory, thick around the middle, bow-legged, promoted past his depth by a brother who needed a colleague he could trust. That portrait may be true. It may also be exactly the portrait a man mourning the death of Roman greatness would need his villain to wear. There is a further shadow on the witness, and it is the darkest one. Between 371 and 372 at Antioch, Valens ran a series of treason trials. The charge was sorcery and divination, men accused of using a small tripod and a ring to spell out the letters of the next emperor's name, and the letters they spelled began Theo. The hunt spread from that, and it swallowed philosophers, notaries, and officials of exactly Ammianus's own class and city. Men burned their own libraries in terror, rather than be found with a book that could hang them. People Ammianus knew died on that emperor's word, some by the sword, some by fire. He describes those trials with a cold fury that never cooled a degree. A man does not write a fair obituary for the ruler who killed his circle and drove his friends to torch their own shelves. The defense contends that Ammianus handed Valens the face his own grief and his own philosophy required, and history has been staring at that face ever since. Now, to the central charge, recklessness. The claim is that Valens knew the true size of the Gothic host and threw his army at it anyway, drunk on the thought of a triumph. That claim rests on an assumption that the emperor possessed the truth and spat on it. But what truth was on the table that August morning? The Roman army was not blind. It fielded scouts, the exploratores, whose entire trade was to ride out, count the enemy, and ride back. These were the men who reported 10,000 Goths at the wagons. Was that report a failure? Yes, a total one. But was it an unreasonable thing to believe? The defense says no, and the ground supports it. The Goths were not a standing army drilling on a parade field. They were a migrating people with mouths to feed and herds to graze. Their fighting strength scattered daily across the countryside in foraging parties, dragging back grain and cattle for tens of thousands of dependents. A force of 10,000 men holding the lager while the rest ranged for food was not merely plausible. Given how such a host actually moved, it was the likely reading. Valens was not told he faced a giant and chose to ignore it. He was told the enemy camp was thin and exposed, and he had a fresh reason to trust that reading. Days earlier, Sebastianus had ambushed a Gothic column near the Maritza River and mauled it, killing raiders and recovering wagons so heavy with plunder that the town of Adrianople could barely hold the recovered goods, and the walls were left standing open to bring it all in. The recent evidence said the Goths were scattered, loaded down, vulnerable. The intelligence and the last real engagement pointed the same way. A commander weighs the last thing that happened as heavily as the map in front of him, and the last thing that had happened was a Roman win. The true weapon, the iron that would break the legions, was the cavalry, Greuthungi lancers and Alan cataphracts, armored men on armored horses under Alathius and Saphrax, and on the morning of the 9th they were not there. They were miles off, foraging, and nothing promised their return within the hour. Valens was not galloping into a visible wall of men. He was closing on a camp, his own eyes and his own scouts called undermanned. To condemn that is to forget what ancient command actually was. No horizon-piercing lens, no rider who could see the whole plain at once, A general divined the enemy from dust, rumor, and the last conflicting scrap a scout gasped out. He read the ground through a haze of smoke and noise where a man could lose sight of his own wings. Valens calculated on bad data and calculated wrong. That is a mistake. A mistake is not a crime. He did not know the horsemen were coming. He stepped into a trap he could not see, which is a different thing from walking into one he could. The defense now enters a second exhibit the prosecution left out entirely: the weight of the throne itself. Understand the job. A 4th-century emperor did not hold a secure office. He ruled by the army's consent, and that consent was rented, never owned. It flowed from one thing: the appearance of strength, luck, and heaven's favor. An emperor who looked weak, hesitant, or unlucky did not draw a pension. He was cut down and replaced by the next man the soldiers cheered. The century behind Valens was a graveyard of rulers murdered by their own troops or their own officers, some purpled and dead inside a single year, some killed by the very guardsmen sworn to shield them. Valens had lived inside that reality from the day he took the purple in 364. Within 2 years, a relative of Julian named Procopius wrapped himself in imperial cloth in Constantinople, won over 2 legions passing through the city, minted his own coin, paraded a small girl of the old imperial line to borrow her blood, and nearly pulled Valens off the throne before the revolt broke apart at Nicolia, and Procopius was handed over by his own commanders and beheaded. Valens did not forget it. He ruled watchful, and his watchfulness was earned in blood. Now set him in the summer of A.D. 378, Goths burning a province that answered to him alone, a capital jeering him as a coward from behind its walls, the hippodrome crowds chanting for him to arm them and lead them out himself, taunting the emperor to his face in his own city, and a nephew half his age riding from the west, crowned in fresh glory from the Rhine, coming to help. The defense asks you to see that help for what it also was, a threat. If Valens waited, if Gratian arrived and shared the victory, or worse, wore the laurel as the man who saved the East, then Valens, the senior Augustus, stood exposed as a ruler who could not manage his own house. Every ambitious general in the empire would read the signal. The next Procopius would start counting supporters in the mess tents. Waiting was the sound military play. It may also have been a slow way to be murdered. The pride Ammianus brands looks, through this lens, more like a man doing the one thing his office demanded of him, winning with his own hand, because a borrowed victory was no victory at all. It was a receipt for his own weakness, signed and handed to every rival in the empire. There is a further point the prosecution slid past. Valens did not build this disaster. He inherited it, already half collapsed. By the time he reached Thrace from the east, the wound was old. The corruption of Lupicinus and Maximus had done the killing work months before. They engineered the famine. They sold the swords across the counter. They sprang the trap at Marcianople that welded a scattered, frightened people into one vengeful blade. The eagles of 2 legions were already gone. The local armies were already broken and stripped, their dead already lying naked in the fields, their gear already on Gothic backs. Fritigern had already learned he could beat Roman troops in the open, and men do not unlearn that lesson. Worse, the war had spread beyond the Goths. Ammianus records that Huns and Alans were being drawn across the river by the promise of plunder, and that bands of them were now riding with Fritigern. The revolt Lupicinus lit had become a magnet pulling every raider between the Danube and the sea. Valens did not arrive to process a border crossing. He arrived to a province in flames, and a war his own subordinates had already lost. His haste was not the disease, it was a response to it. A surgeon handed a patient already emptying onto the table, then blamed for the cut another man made. And the famous war council on the eve of battle deserves a second reading, because Ammianus's own text betrays the tidy picture drawn from it. The prosecution shows a lone, arrogant emperor, waving away the unanimous wisdom of gray-haired generals. But Ammianus says plainly that the council was split. Victor the Sarmatian, a cautious veteran of the Persian frontier and a man married into the imperial circle, urged the emperor to wait for Gratian. Ricomeres, the Frankish officer Gratian had sent ahead, carried the same plea and had already offered his own body as a hostage to buy the delay. A second faction pushed hard the other way, Sebastianus at its head, the officer who had just bled the Goths and come back certain that speed would win. He had drawn blood and tasted it. He pressed for an immediate strike, and there were younger men around the table who wanted the same, who saw laurels waiting on a plain 8 miles off and reputations to be made before the West arrived to take them. Valens was not a solitary madman ranting at cautious men. He was a commander-in-chief, hearing 2 competing doctrines from his own staff. One counseled patience, the other counseled attack, and attack was the oldest instinct the legions had. For 4 centuries, the foundational law of the Roman army was aggression. March to the noise, find the enemy, force a pitched fight, destroy him. Boldness was not Valens's dangerous invention. Boldness had conquered the world. It was the choice Caesar made at the Sabes in 57 BC, when the Nervi burst from the tree line and nearly overran his half-built camp, and he snatched a shield from a rear-rank man and threw himself into the front line to hold it. It was the choice Scipio made when he carried the war into Africa against every cautious voice in the Senate and ended Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC. It was the doctrine Vegetius, writing in this very century, still pressed on Roman commanders as the mark of a real general, that the bold stroke delivered fast wins where the timid one rots in camp. Valens made a Roman decision. That it ended in ruin does not turn it, in hindsight, into insanity. Consider also what waiting would have cost on the ground. An army does not sit still for free. Gratian was still weeks out, slowed on the road by a flare-up with the Lentienses behind him on the Rhine, and by a fever that laid him low at one halt. To wait meant to hold a large field army in the field through the worst of August, drawing down grain in a province the Goths had already stripped bare. Every day of delay fed Valens's men from stores that were not there, and gave Fritigern's scattered cavalry more time to gather. The cautious option was not free of risk. It carried its own slow ruin. The defense does not need to prove that attacking was wise. It needs only to prove that both roads ran into the dark, and they did. And there is one last thing the record of that morning shows. Fritigern himself kept sending envoys, drawing out the talk hour by hour, asking for hostages, proposing terms he never meant to keep. A man who commands 10,000 cornered infantry against a Roman field army does not beg for time. A man waiting for a hammer to arrive does. The very stalling that looks in Ammianus like Fritigern's cunning was also, to Valens standing in the heat, one more sign that the enemy was weak and afraid. The trap wore the face of surrender right up until it closed. Everything in this trial, every fact for the prosecution and every fact for the defense, comes from one book, the history of Ammianus Marcellinus. It is a masterpiece, a raw dispatch from a world coming apart, written by a man who wore the armor he describes and outlived the emperors he judged. His account, published in English as The Later Roman Empire, is the source this whole investigation is built on. You can hold it yourself. Tap the View Products button on this screen, and it is there. Reading it is not like reading a modern summary of these events. It is like handling the evidence with your own hands, in the historian's own voice, prejudices and all. While the shelf is open, look through the other pieces we have gathered to sit alongside the story. Curated relics and dark keepsakes chosen to carry this world off the screen and into the room you are sitting in. Open the shop shelf now and take a piece of it with you. The defense rests. Valens stands before you, not as a cardboard villain, but as a man boxed in on every side. Boxed by a rotted administration that had turned a province into stacked kindling. Boxed by the merciless arithmetic of the throne, which punished the look of weakness harder than it punished failure. Boxed by the fog of a war fought without eyes in the sky, acting on the best and worst intelligence his own scouts could bring him. Boxed between two factions shouting opposite orders across his own tent. Boxed by a clock that ran against him, whether he moved or stood still. The prosecution wants a clean fork in the road, wisdom on one side, pride on the other, and a fool who chose wrong. The defense answers that there was no clean fork. There were only gambles, and he took the one that had carried Rome for 500 years. Could any emperor standing in that tent on that morning, fed that exact report and pressed by those exact fears, have reasonably chosen another way? Hold the question. Because while the envoys still talked, and Richomeres still rode toward the Gothic camp under a flag of truce, two Roman units on the right, the archers and the shield-bearers under an officer named Becurius, broke discipline and lunged forward on their own, and the fragile talking snapped like a bowstring, and out past the smoke of the burning grass, the horsemen of Elathius and Saphrax crested the ridge, coming down on the Roman flank like a hillside breaking loose, and they were not slowing down. The defense has rested. The witness has been questioned, and his motives laid bare. Now the plain itself renders judgment, and the plain does not deal in mercy. The battle began by accident. The two lines stood facing each other across the scorched grass, some 8 miles from the walls of Adrianople, envoys still passing between them, when a body of Roman troops on the right, the archers and the shield-bearers under an officer named Becurius, an Iberian prince from the Caucasus serving in Roman pay, surged forward without orders. Ammianus names them precisely because he wants the blame placed where it fell. Perhaps discipline snapped after hours in the sun. Perhaps a young officer wanted the first kill and the first plunder. Whatever the reason, arrows flew, the truce died in that instant, and a general advance rolled forward that no one had commanded and no one could recall. The legions moved out, a wall of iron and painted shields, but the wall was already crooked. 8 miles of heat and thirst had frayed the ranks before a blade was drawn, and the units had come onto the field piecemeal, some still forming up as others engaged. On the Roman left, the cavalry pushed hard against the Gothic line, and for a few breaths seemed to be winning ground, pressing toward the ring of wagons where the enemy families sheltered. Fritigern had drawn those wagons into a great circle, the lager, and behind them stood not only his fighting men, but the women, the old, and the children of a whole nation, watching the Romans come. He had spent the whole morning sending envoys back and forth to buy the hour he needed, and now the hour had come. Then, from beyond the low ridge to the north, came a sound the Romans felt before they heard it. Hooves, thousands of them, rolling like a wave gathering weight. It was Elatheus and Saphrax. The Gothic heavy cavalry had come back from foraging at the 1 hour that would cost Rome everything. Ammianus, who had stood in enough battle lines to know what such a charge does to men on foot, spends only a line on it, and the line lands like a dropped stone. They came down from the mountains like a thunderbolt, and swept away everything in their path. They did not waste themselves on the Roman horsemen. They swept past them. They drove full weight into the exposed right flank of the Roman infantry, Grotunghi lancers and Alan cataphracts, men and horses both in scale armor, striking a mass already leaning the wrong way. The timing could not have been worse for Rome. The legions were committed, pressing into the wagon circle, their whole momentum carrying them forward when the flank behind them caved. The Roman cavalry, both wings, was scattered or ridden into the dirt. Ammianus records that the left wing had actually reached the wagons and might have pushed further, but no support came up behind it, and when the cavalry broke, it was left hanging in the air, cut off and rolled up. When the horsemen were gone, the infantry stood alone, the trained corps of the Eastern Empire surrounded, with no open ground behind them and nowhere to go. What followed was not a last stand of song, it was compression. The Roman line did not break outward, it was squeezed inward. Goths poured from behind the wagons in front, the cavalry closed from the flanks and the rear. The whole mass of the enemy folded around the legions like a fist closing on a coal. The soldiers were packed together, shield against shield, shoulder against shoulder, until a man could no longer draw his arm back to strike. They could not raise their shields against the arrows and javelins falling into them from above. They could only stand and be pressed, cooking inside their mail under a white sky, breathing the dust that thousands of feet and hooves had beaten up off the dry ground. That dust hung over the field like a drawn curtain, mixed with the smoke of the burning stubble Fritigern's men had lit before the battle, until soldiers could not tell a friend's helmet from an enemy's a spear length away. Ammianus, remembering the sound more than the sight, writes of the ceaseless clash of iron, of the hiss of arrows, of the ground so wet underfoot that men lost their footing and could not rise again in the crush. He describes horses maddened and riderless, plunging through the press, and spears so densely thrown that they could not miss. He describes the moment the Roman soldiers were pinned so tight they could not even fall, the dead held upright by the living, packed around them, carried along in the ranks like standing men. He writes that some cut through the enemy and fled, and that the throats of both sides went hoarse from shouting until only the ring of metal and the groans of the fallen remained. In that heaving box, the Roman army stopped being an army. For hours the killing went on, patient and mechanical, from past midday until the light began to fail behind the western hills. When it was over, 2/3 of the eastern field army lay in the grass. Perhaps 20,000 professional soldiers, the figure the historians reached for only one comparison to hold. Cannae, the day Hannibal ringed and destroyed a Roman army in 216 BC. Ammianus himself makes that comparison, and no Roman writer chose it lightly, because Cannae had been the deepest scar in the national memory for nearly 600 years. He adds that no battle since had cost Rome so dear, and that the moon rose over a field the survivors dared not cross, littered so thick with the dead that men could not pick a path through them. 35 tribunes died in that field, the whole officer spine of the force. Two masters of soldiers went down with their men, Trajanus and Sebastianus, the very general who had urged the attack. Sebastianus won the swift victory he wanted and did not live an hour past it. Valerianus, the count of the stable, was killed. Equitius, a kinsman of the emperor and grand marshal of the court, vanished in the rout and was never found. Whole regiments with long histories, the Cornuti, the Lanciarii, the Batavi, ceased to exist as names on a muster roll. The experience of a generation of campaigns, the knowledge that could not be set down in any manual, was erased between one afternoon and one dusk, and the swords doing the cutting were, in more than a few hands, the very blades Lupicinus had let the Goths buy across a warehouse counter 2 years before. The corruption at the crossing had come the long way around to finish its own work. The verdict on Valens is erasure. In the last of it, his guard abandoned him. The palace guard called up, as a reserve was found to have already fled the field. Ammianus notes the gap where they should have stood and calls it the moment hope died. Valens was left with a handful of loyal men, and here the account of our chief witness splits in two, because the field was too confused for any single truth to survive it. In the first version, Valens took an arrow among the last ranks of the Lanciarii and the Mattiarii, 2 infantry units that held together longest, and he died there unmarked, his body sinking beneath a heap of common soldiers, never to be told apart from the thousands around him. In the second, his men carried the wounded emperor to a farmhouse close behind the lines and barred the door. Archers climbed to the upper floor and kept the Goths off for a time, shooting down from the roof. The Goths, not knowing whose life they were storming after, piled brushwood against the walls and set it alight. Ammianus writes that a single guardsman leapt from a window in the smoke and, taken alive, told his captors who had burned inside, and that the Goths, hearing it, cursed their luck, because they had destroyed the one prize that would have crowned the day and never known they held it. We will never know which happened. His body was never recovered from that field. There was no state funeral, no marble mausoleum, no vote of the Senate to raise him among the gods, as Rome had done for its dead emperors since Augustus was deified in AD 14. Rome was denied the right of mourning its Augustus, and the Goths were denied the trophy that would have made the victory complete, an emperor's corpse to carry home. The record convicts Valens of failure, and his sentence is to disappear from it entirely, a ghost on a plain that swallowed him whole. He had reigned 14 years and left no tomb, no bones, no marker. But Valens was never truly the defendant. The final verdict falls on the machine that marched him there. The Roman system is found guilty. Adrianople did not begin the decline of Rome. It was the disease made visible, an audit written in blood on the fields of Thrace. The empire had handed the management of its frontier to a bureaucracy that fed on it. The offices meant to move grain moved profit instead. The men posted to guard the border were more interested in the silver they could squeeze from it than in the state they had sworn to serve. The apparatus had grown too corrupt to perform the simplest tasks it existed to perform: feed the hungry, disarm the settled, enforce the law at the crossing. Instead, it manufactured an enemy out of a column of refugees, turned a routine settlement into a war, and then armed that enemy with the tools to win it. The legions did not die because the Goths were unbeatable. They died because the clerks, the governors, and the frontier counts had hollowed the empire from the inside long before the horsemen came over the ridge, and the verdict reshaped the world. The man who inherited the wreckage was a Spanish general named Theodosius, son of a famous soldier whom Valens's own regime had executed at Carthage only a few years earlier. Theodosius was raised to the eastern throne in January 329 at Sirmium, with an army that no longer existed. His predecessor was a rumor without a grave. The victorious Goths ranged freely through Thrace and Macedonia, and no field force stood between them and the walls of Constantinople, where the Empress Dominica opened the treasury and handed out imperial gold to arm the citizens because there were no soldiers left to defend the capital. In one small mercy early on, a band of Goths who tested the walls of Constantinople was thrown back by a company of Saracen cavalry serving Rome, a moment Ammianus records with grim wonder, since the sight of the fighting so unnerved even the Goths that they drew off. But such moments only underlined how far things had fallen when the capital's defense turned on hired foreign horsemen. Theodosius could not beat the Goths. He had nothing to beat them with. He spent 3 years rebuilding an army almost from nothing, drafting miners and farmers and settling old scores. And in the end, he did a thing no Roman emperor had done before. On the 3rd of October 382, he signed a treaty. It was not a surrender, which would have been cleaner. It was something with a longer poison. The Goths were not disarmed. They were not broken into small parties and scattered across the provinces to dissolve into the population over 2 generations, as the old rule had always required. The very rule Lupicinus had been paid to enforce and had sold instead. They were settled whole as one people on Roman soil south of the Danube in the provinces of Moesia and Thrace, as a nation that governed itself. They received land, grain, and relief from taxes. In return, they would serve the Roman army as foederati, federated troops fighting under their own chiefs, by their own custom, at their own word. On the surface, it looked like statecraft. Theodosius had filled his empty ranks overnight and turned the enemy that ruined the East into a nominal ally. The court orator Themistius, the same voice who had praised the original settlement of AD 306, now stood before the Senate and praised this one too, arguing that it was nobler to fill Thrace with farmers than with graves, and that a wise ruler conquers by kindness. Underneath the fine speeches, it was a slow-acting toxin. For the first time, a barbarian nation existed inside the Roman frontier as a distinct whole thing, a people with its own leaders and its own loyalties, a state lodged within the state, obeying Rome only so far as it chose to. The precedent set the pattern for the century that followed. Hire barbarians to fight Rome's wars became the standing military policy of the late empire. The army grew steadily less Roman and steadily more dependent on Gothic, Frankish, and Allan warlords, whose loyalty was rented, never owned, and always available at a higher price. Within a generation, the most powerful soldier in the West would be a man of Vandal blood named Stilicho, guardian of an emperor and master of Rome's armies, and the empire's survival would rest on warlords who had been born outside it. The Goths, settled in 382, were the fathers of the Federate soldiers who, one generation on, would feel cheated by a Roman state that never quite paid what it promised and never quite treated them as equals. Their leader was a man named Alaric, born, some say, on an island in the Danube delta in the very years after Adrianople. Alaric had learned Roman war from the inside, commanding Gothic federates in Theodosius's own campaigns, including the bloody victory at the river Frigidus in September 394, where Gothic troops were spent by the thousand in the front rank while Roman units held back and watched. He never forgot the arithmetic of that day. that Rome would happily fight its wars with Gothic bodies and keep the honors for itself. He asked Rome for a proper command and was refused. He asked for the promised grain and was stalled. In August 410, he did the thing that had not happened in 800 years, not since the Gauls sacked the city in 390 BC. He led his Gothic army through the Salarian Gate of Rome and gave the ancient city over to 3 days of plunder. Word of it reached a monk named Jerome in his cell in Bethlehem, and he wrote that his voice failed and sobs broke his words, that the city which had taken the whole world had itself been taken. Alaric was no stranger from beyond the world's edge. He was the harvest of the seed Theodosius planted in the ruin of Adrianople. The story ends here, but the sentence carries down the centuries. The defeat on the 9th of August, AD 378, was not finally a tactical loss or a military one. It was existential. On that afternoon, the Roman Empire took a wound it never closed. It lost the one thing that makes a state, the sole right to wield legitimate force inside its own borders. After Adrianople, that right went out to contract. The empire began to pay the men at the gate to serve as the gate's keepers, and in paying them, it handed over the keys to the house. The collapse did not arrive all at once. 98 years still separated Adrianople from the day a Germanic officer named Odoacer set aside the last Western emperor, a boy called Romulus Augustulus, in 476. But the lock was broken on that plain, in the dust and the burning grass, and everything after was only the door swinging slowly open, and the men who broke it were not the Goths. They were Lupicinus and Maximus, working a warehouse counter 2 years before the first arrow flew, weighing bread against children and swords against silver. The battle was lost in that account book long before it was lost in the field. Ammianus knew it. He wrote it down in a fury he never hid. An old soldier from Antioch setting the record straight for a court of history that would sit 16 centuries later, closing his great work on this battle and laying down his pen with the promise that better men than he might tell what came after. That is the last thing to hold. The witness who convicted Valens also handed us the evidence to look past him, to the ledger, and the men who kept it. Thank you for staying to the end of this investigation. If tracing the real machinery of the past is something you value, subscribe to the channel, tap the like button, and send this to one person who needs to see how empires actually fall, not with a single blow, but with a ledger and a locked warehouse. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube, and the story does not stop on this battlefield. The video now appearing on your screen is the next chapter waiting for you. Click it. Continue the descent. We will be there when you arrive.